To be honest with you guys, Vendreads are pretty good. No, hold on. I'm not talking about the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG. I'm talking about Duel Links. Okay, now that we have that covered, oh my god. So if you guys didn't know, we recently got a new mini box in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links that contains Vendreads. Vendreads are a ritual-based archetype revolved around zombies, recurring zombies from the grave. So basically, your ritual spells can summon the Vendreads from the grave, and so overall, it's really strong. Why are Vendreads so good in Duel Links, and why is it realistically the quote-unquote best deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain why Vendreads are good and why they are better than every other competitively viable deck in Duel Links, and give my opinion as to why Vendreads are the best deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. So basically, Vendreads are an archetype revolved around you ritual summoning zombie monsters. These zombie monsters aren't really the most substantial cards, but basically the idea is everything floats. Your Vendread Slayer, when sent from the field to the graveyard, can add a ritual spell and send a Vendread monster, so that's insane value. Your Vendread Executor is also another monster that floats by when it gets destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect. You can add a Vendread card from your deck to your hand. Vendread Origin can ritual summon from the grave, meaning it's more resource efficient. So if you see what I'm saying, basically everything is somehow resource efficient or there is some floating involved. It's really good. Duel Links hasn't really had a deck that floats this much, so Vendreads are realistically really hard to deal with. You basically have to stun them and then OTK them in one turn. You can't really get into the grind game with Vendreads because their grind game is so much better than every other deck's. So what does a standard list look like? Well, basically the best cards in the archetype are your ritual spells. You need to max out on your ritual spells because if you don't see a ritual spell, you're losing. The ritual spells also give you a dynamic where you aren't very reliant on your normal summon at all. So that's why you can play some cards like Sonic Bird to get you access to your other ritual spells. So there's been a lot of times where Sonic Bird is really good. Both of the ritual spells are value town, and so you usually rather ritual summon with those than any other ritual spell. However, there's other cards you can play. So for example, you can play Contract with the Abyss. That card isn't necessarily as good as Sonic Bird, and of course you'd be playing Contract with something like Level Duplication, let me just specify, but Contract of the Abyss means you don't need to use your normal summon on that, which means you can use your normal summon on one of the more powerful normal summons. What I mean by a power normal summon is all of your effect monsters in the archetype give your ritual monsters some sort of effect if they were ritual summoned from the field. Vendread Revenants has an effect that gives to your ritual monster. If your opponent controls a special summon monster, you can use this effect to banish it. So target one face-up special summon monster, banish it. It's really strong, honestly. Well, it doesn't sound that oppressive for something like the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG and Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. That's incredible, especially because all of your monsters are already floating regardless. They have one to banish a spell and trap, they have one that prevents targeting. You have a lot of options with how you approach Vendreads. So for example though, most people are playing a variant where you're running the field spell, Vendread Knights, which is honestly really strong because sometimes you want the grave setup, so even though you're discarding one, it's not actually that big of a deal because most of the time you'll just be discarding a ritual monster. You can then add any of your Vendread monsters from your deck to the hand, whatever you need in that scenario. It doesn't add ritual spells, but it's still really good because it has the versatility of either grabbing more disruption or grabbing another monster. So in general, Vendread Knights is a huge consistency boost. So alright, the deck looks pretty good. Usually you can, at max, if you really wanted to, you can play technically 12 ritual spells with 3 Contract of the Abyss, 3 Sonic Bird, and the 3 of each Vendread's ritual spell. That's definitely way too many, so you realistically need like 7 to 9 ritual spells to make your deck as consistent as possible. But with that in mind, you're also playing ritual monsters, so you can play 2 Slayer, 2 Executor, and then realistically, if you want to, you can play Battle Lord as well. It's not that bad at all because it helps you force out trap cards, and then once you force out a trap card, if it's not something like Canadia, then you're basically basically forcing out a bunch of stuff. If you summon Executor first and then Battle Lord, then it's going to be really hard for your opponent to stop that. So as you can see, the deck actually looks pretty good. One thing I personally feel like a deck needs in order for it to be really good is some form of inherent disruption, at least for a combo deck sense. So let's take a look at a deck like Six Samurai. Six Samurai obviously was an amazing Yu-Gi-Oh deck in Duel Links, and it's still a decent deck right now. The reason why I felt Six Samurai was so good is because it has inherent disruption and it's so consistent at outputting that disruption. And it's honestly the same thing with Vendreads. Vendreads honestly have a really easy time putting out a disruption with their ritual monster, and you can even put something like Master of Rites as your skill, and then your Executor becomes untargetable, and then it also has the banish effect, making it even harder to deal with. Even cards like Lava Golem, which are typically really good at dealing with boards, aren't as good because your monsters just float. Well, it deals with 2 Executors just fine. If you have a Slayer and an Executor, or you just have 1 ritual monster on the field, it's going to be really hard to deal with that because they just get the resources back. Some general counters for this deck is a skill like Seal Tomb. Seal Tomb's amazing against Vendreads. Honestly, it's so good. Another card is Herald of the Abyss. While it's not like the most impactful card ever, it can deal with your Vendreads because it doesn't enable their effects basically. So it's not bad at all, but it's not like the greatest thing in the world. Maybe there's other cards, but those are just 2 examples of some counters to Vendreads. Now, to be fair, I can't just go out on a limb and say Vendreads are the best deck if I don't prove it by comparing them to other decks. Obviously, Vendreads do seem really good at first glance. They have all of this floating potential. Their resource game is really strong, but if they just lose to the other decks and aren't as competent as the other decks, then what's the point in even talking about them? Let's take a look at a deck like Desperado. Desperado is a really competent deck, and while Desperado can play a bunch of counters to a deck like Vendreads because Desperado is just a control deck and it can inherently do something like that, it can't play stuff like Seal Tombs. However, it doesn't change that Desperado can struggle a bit. It has non-targeting removal inside the archetype, which is really good against Vendreads because that means their targeting protection isn't really as good. But when you have a card like REVENDREAD Origin in the grave, then it turns off that destruction effect, and your Executors is already bigger than your Desperado Dragon. So realistically, Vendreads don't have the hardest time in the world. It can be difficult at times playing through the back row, but with tech cards coming out over time and easier ways of dealing with back row, and cards like Hound Horde helping you and assisting you in dealing with back row, it's not the hardest thing in the world to play through back row. In a grind game sense, Vendreads are definitely the better deck just because everything floats. It can be hard again to deal with the back row, but over time, once you start whittling down their resources, it's hard for the opponent to keep up if they're playing Desperado, just because you have the better grind game. And honestly, the deck can output OTKs out of nowhere just because inherently it's a ritual deck and it can spam really well. Against a deck like Triamids aren't bad at all, but I think it's a bit overwhelming to deal with such big monsters. While you have a card like Triamid Pulse in order to help you deal with it, it's okay because you're already basically ritual summoning 2 times a turn regardless, and there's not really anything good to hit. So for example, if I wanted to, let's say, use Triamid Pulse on a ritual monster, okay, cool, I'll just use the effect and float into something else. So it basically makes it harder to deal with. And while decks like Spellbooks are actually pretty decent against Vendreads because of a card like Fate, and you can negate one of the ritual spells, so Spellbooks generally have a decent matchup against Vendreads. In the grand scheme of things, in general, Vendreads are a really strong deck. It is probably the most aggressive deck of the format. I think it's taking Six Samurai's place as the new best combo deck. In the end, Vendreads are definitely the most aggressive deck of the format, one of the most powerful. They can lose to specific cards a bit harder than other decks, so they don't have like as much versatility, especially because most of your hand needs to be dedicated to your Vendread monsters in order to continue ritual summoning. They just keep floating and they keep clearing your opponent's resources. Like, I don't know how else to describe describe it other than there isn't really a deck as good as Vendread's in the format right now. Vendread can have bad matchups and it can lose, don't get me wrong, it's nothing like tier 0 or anything, as I say that it becomes tier 0, no, but Vendreads are just generally the best deck. They have the most dimensions of play, they aren't normal summon reliant. Hopefully you guys understand what I'm saying when I tell you that Vendreads are the best deck. There's a reason I've only invested in 2 decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. The first one was 6 Samurai, and we all know how that went. But the second deck was Vendread's. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to go down into the description and join my Discord server. There's discussions on everything Yu-Gi-Oh! Related, whether it be the TCG, Duel Links, etc. If you guys want more Duel Links discussions like this one, make sure to comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this one. And with that, guys, I hope to see you soon.